Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about a dynamic that's quietly playing out in countless relationships right now, the collision between an avoidant and a super empath. On the surface, they look like they'd fit. One pulls away, the other leans in. One needs space, the other gives grace. But here's the twist that balance. It's an illusion, and sooner or later, it cracks. Let's break it down. Avoidants protect themselves with distance. They fear engulfment, vulnerability, and the perceived loss of independence. They often want love, but they push it away the second it gets close. Enter the super empath. A super empath doesn't just feel, you see, you sense. You know, when someone's pulling back and instead of running, you lean forward, you offer softness, understanding, patience. You decode silences. You fill in the emotional blanks. But here's where the avoidant fails. They're used to people chasing them. They rely on being misunderstood. They get safety from ambiguity. But a super empath, you don't play that game. You name things. You call out avoidance, not with blame, but with clarity. And clarity is an avoidance kryptonite. A super empath won't beg. You'll open the door, but you won't keep it open forever. You'll hold space, but you won't stay in limbo. And when an avoidant sees that their distance no longer has power, when their silence no longer manipulates, they panic. This is when the avoidant strategy collapses, not because the super empath got angry, but because you stayed grounded. You offered real connection and you didn't abandon yourself to do it. So what happens next? The avoidant either grows or the empath walks. Because the truth is, being deeply empathetic isn't about self-sacrifice, it's about discernment, about knowing the difference between someone who's healing and someone who's hiding. Avoidants often live in the safety of emotional ambiguity. They rely on vague language, mixed messages, and half commitments to protect themselves from intimacy they secretly crave but deeply fear. This way of being works well when they're with someone who is insecure or uncertain, someone who will accept breadcrumbs and fill in emotional gaps with hope. But the moment they meet a super empath, the dynamic shifts. Because a super empath doesn't just feel the energy in a room. They rate it, decode it, and name it. And that's the problem for the avoidant. Avoidants thrive when their emotional distance goes unquestioned. They're used to their withdrawal being misread as just needing space or being busy. They avoid confrontation by keeping things undefined. But a super empath doesn't tolerate emotional vagueness. You call it what it is. If someone pulls away, you notice not just that they're retreating, but why. You don't demand connection, but you make it clear that inconsistency is noticed. That subtle confrontation, the gentle naming of what's really happening, is deeply unsettling for the avoidant. Clarity disarms avoidance in the most uncomfortable way. It's not aggressive, it's not needy, it's just precise. You might say, I've noticed that when things get closer, you tend to disappear a bit. That alone is powerful. Avoidants aren't used to their patterns being noticed in real time. They depend on people questioning themselves, not the avoidant. But an empath isn't lost in guessing games. You see the shift in energy, you feel the emotional retreat, and instead of taking it personally or spiraling, you put it into words. That moment, when you articulate what's happening without drama, is the moment the avoidance strategy begins to fall apart. What makes this especially powerful is that it's done with calm presence. You're not blaming. You're not accusing. You're just refusing to play the game. Avoidants feel most in control when they're unpredictable. They control the pace of intimacy by pulling away, creating a sense of longing and uncertainty. But a super empath doesn't chase, they observe. You don't match the chaos, you ground it. And in doing so, you remove the avoidant sense of power. The avoidant may respond with defensiveness, confusion, or even temporary withdrawal because clarity threatens their emotional autopilot. But the clarity keeps coming. The empath doesn't back down. You continue to offer presence and direct communication. You don't force vulnerability, but you invite it, and that invitation feels risky for someone who associates closeness with danger. Avoidants often expect people to tolerate the push-pull, to internalize the distance as rejection, or to anxiously try to fix it. When that doesn't happen, When the empath neither clings nor collapses, they're left with a mirror. That mirror reflects not only the impact of their behavior, but the truth that they can no longer hide behind confusion. And for someone who's relied on murky emotional waters to feel safe, being seen so clearly can feel like exposure. That's why clarity is so powerful. It's not just about communication. It's about energetic boundaries. The super empath doesn't just speak, they stand. And the avoidant realizes that their usual defenses don't work when they're no longer misunderstood. Empathy, when unguarded, can quickly turn into emotional labor that drains instead of nourishes. Super empaths are wired to understand, to feel deeply, to sense shifts in tone, silence, and energy. This sensitivity is a gift, but without boundaries, it becomes a burden. When a super empath enters a dynamic with an avoidant, the risk isn't just emotional disconnection, it's self-abandonment. The empath may begin to overextend, making excuses for the avoidant's distance, interpreting detachment as a wound to be healed rather than a choice being made. The danger here is subtle but profound. Avoidants tend to create emotional gaps, delays in communication, limited vulnerability, unclear intentions, and empaths, out of compassion, often rush to fill those gaps with understanding and grace. But when this becomes a repeated pattern, empathy shifts from a strength into a cycle of emotional overfunctioning. The empath becomes the one constantly reaching, interpreting, adapting. It starts from a place of care, but without clear limits, it leads to burnout. Super empaths often believe that if they just love harder, stay patient longer, or hold space more generously, the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to come forward. But that belief can become a trap. Empathy becomes a performance of endurance, a quiet persistence to prove worthiness or to unlock the other person's emotional depth. The avoidant, consciously or unconsciously, begins to rely on this. They grow used to not showing up fully because they know the empath will do the emotional heavy lifting. But empathy without boundaries isn't love. It's leakage. It's giving from depletion, not from wholeness. And that pattern is not sustainable. The super empath begins to feel emotionally bankrupt, wondering why they're so tired, anxious, or unseen in a relationship where they've given so much. That internal depletion doesn't usually happen all at once. It builds slowly with each unanswered message, each vague promise, each subtle withdrawal that the empath quietly absorbs and accommodates. True empathy includes the self. It's not just about understanding another person's pain or fear. It's about recognizing when your own emotional needs are consistently unmet. Super empaths must learn to differentiate between compassion and caretaking, between presence and overextension. It's one thing to be supportive, it's another to carry a relationship on your back while the other person keeps you at arm's length. What avoidants often don't anticipate is that the super empath has a threshold. At some point, the emotional giving stops, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The empath pulls back, not to punish, but to preserve. And this is when the avoidant faces the consequences of their distance, because the empath, who once bent and softened and held space without being asked, no longer has the capacity or the desire to keep doing so without reciprocity. When the empath stops overgiving, the dynamic changes. The avoidant, who depended on the imbalance, now finds themselves exposed. The silent assumption that the empath will always be there starts to unravel, because even the most deeply feeling people cannot pour from an empty cup. And once an empath sees that their empathy is being consumed but not returned, they begin to step back, not out of coldness, but in self-respect. Avoidants often use silence as a way to maintain control and create emotional distance. It's not always intentional or malicious. It's a learned behavior, a survival tactic shaped by fear of intimacy and vulnerability. For them, withdrawing into silence feels safer than engaging in uncomfortable emotional territory. In many relationships, this tactic works. The other person becomes anxious, starts questioning themselves, reaches out more, tries to fix things. The avoidant regains a sense of power by being the one who sets the emotional pace through their absence. But when they meet a super empath, that dynamic quietly begins to unravel. Super empaths interpret silence differently. While they are attuned to emotional shifts and can feel the tension behind words left unsaid, they don't immediately personalize it. Instead of spiraling into self-doubt, they observe. They notice the silence, acknowledge it, and begin to understand its purpose. Most importantly, they don't let it dictate their sense of worth. This is where the avoidance strategy begins to fail, the usual emotional reaction they depend on. Panic, pursuit, apology doesn't come. Instead, the empath offers space, but not submission. They don't chase. They don't fill the silence with noise or desperate reassurances. They stand still and grounded. That emotional stillness is unsettling to someone who uses silence as leverage. The avoidant expects their withdrawal to provoke something, maybe a confrontation, maybe reassurance, maybe even guilt. But when none of that arrives, they're left facing their own emotional void without the distraction of another person trying to bridge it for them. The silence becomes their own mirror, and it reflects back the pattern they've relied on for so long, retreating instead of reaching. Super empaths are not easily manipulated by emotional inconsistency. Their sensitivity is paired with emotional intelligence. They know the difference between someone needing space to self-regulate and someone using distance as a means to avoid connection. They honor the former and call out the latter, not always with words, but with their behavior. They step back with grace, not because they're indifferent, but because they refuse to beg for closeness. That restraint sends a clear, quiet message. I'm not here to prove I'm worthy of connection, you are. This response strips the avoidant of their usual power. Suddenly, silence stops being a weapon. It no longer creates anxiety in the other person. Instead, it isolates the avoidant. The empath's refusal to be pulled into the push-pull cycle disrupts the pattern completely. The avoidant realizes, often unconsciously, that the emotional distance they've used to feel safe now leaves them alone. Not just physically, but energetically. The emotional labor they're used to outsourcing is no longer being done for them. In this space, the avoidant faces a choice. Continue retreating and risk losing someone who actually understands them, or step forward and engage in a way that feels vulnerable but real. For the super empath, silence isn't a gap to be frantically filled. It's information. It reveals what words often conceal. And when silence is no longer met with pursuit or emotional panic, the entire foundation of the avoidance control starts to collapse. Avoidants are often stuck in patterns that protect them from vulnerability, but also prevent them from experiencing true intimacy. They crave connection, but the moment it starts to feel real, their defense mechanisms kick in. They pull back, shut down, or create emotional distance, not because they don't care, but because closeness feels like danger. This pattern can continue for years, even decades if it goes unchallenged. But when an avoidant meets a super empath, those defenses are tested in a way they've likely never experienced before. And the outcome of that test hinges on one simple reality: the only way forward is growth. A super empath brings clarity, presence, and depth. They don't just offer affection, they offer emotional availability, vulnerability, and truth. In the early stages, the avoidant might find this incredibly attractive. It feels safe, warm, inviting. But as the connection deepens, the old fears rise up. The avoidant starts to feel exposed. The pace feels intense, not because the empath is pushing, but because they're consistent. That consistency leaves no room for the usual retreat. The empath doesn't create chaos. They don't chase. They hold steady, and that steadiness forces the avoidant to confront their internal chaos. In the past, avoidants may have counted on their partners lowering their standards to maintain the relationship. People often compromise their emotional needs just to keep the peace, especially when they fear abandonment. But the super empath doesn't operate from fear. They give the benefit of the doubt, but they don't ignore patterns. They are compassionate, but not blind. And most importantly, they are emotionally self-aware. That awareness means they can recognize when their empathy is being used as a cushion for someone else's avoidance. They don't stay silent just to keep things going. They speak up, not aggressively, but truthfully. This is the turning point. The avoidant is faced with something they're not used to: accountability in the face of love. not judgment, not criticism, just a reflection of how their behavior affects the dynamic. And in that moment, the only sustainable path forward is growth. They can no longer hide behind the excuse of being misunderstood. They are being understood, possibly for the first time in their lives. And that's exactly what terrifies them, because being understood leaves no room to hide. It demands evolution. The avoidant must choose to either step into discomfort and begin to shift their pattern, or continue retreating and lose someone who truly sees them. Super empaths do not wait forever. They don't punish the avoidant for their fear, but they also don't shrink themselves to accommodate it. They love deeply, but they don't love foolishly. At some point, the empath's presence becomes a mirror that's too honest to ignore. The avoidant either begins the hard work of opening up, of learning how to stay present, communicate, and emotionally engage, or they're left alone with their defenses, which now feel more like a cage than a shelter. Growth, in this context, isn't about perfection. It's about effort. It's about showing up scared, but still showing up. Avoidants don't have to become emotional experts overnight, but they do have to stop hiding, because in the presence of a super empath, avoidance is no longer a sustainable option. It's a choice that costs them real connection. Super empaths are often mistaken for fixers, healers, or emotional rescuers. Their deep compassion, combined with their ability to sense and hold space for others, makes them magnets for people who are emotionally unavailable or struggling with intimacy. Avoidants are particularly drawn to this energy. It feels safe, non-judgmental, and deeply nurturing. But what avoidants frequently misinterpret is that the empath's compassion doesn't equal compliance. Super empaths are not in the business of rescuing anyone. They're in the business of recognizing who's ready to meet them halfway and who isn't. At first, the avoidant may feel a kind of emotional relief in the empath's presence. They don't have to explain themselves in detail. The empath understands. They sense the fear, the push-pull, the hesitation. But instead of reacting with neediness or pressure, the empath offers grace. This often lulls the avoidant into a false sense of security. They think, this person will wait. They'll keep giving. I don't have to change. And for a while, that might be true. The empath will give, listen, and offer emotional safety. But this doesn't last forever, because empathy without recognition becomes exploitation. Super empaths aren't naive. They feel everything, including the moment when their care stops being honored. And when that moment comes, something shifts. They no longer see the avoidant through a lens of potential. They see them for who they're choosing to be right now. That clarity changes everything. The empath no longer gives endlessly in the hope of transformation. They begin to discern, is this person emotionally unavailable because they're in transition and working on themselves, or because they're hiding from growth and using my empathy as a shield? That's the difference between rescuing and recognizing. Rescuing says, I will carry this relationship until you're ready. Recognizing says, I see your pain, but I also see your patterns, and I won't make myself small just to stay connected to you. Super empaths eventually understand that love isn't just about understanding someone's wounds. It's also about honoring your own needs. Compassion isn't unconditional access. It has a limit. When empathy is met with avoidance, resistance, and a refusal to engage emotionally, the empath doesn't push, they step back. This isn't a punishment, it's protection. Super empaths know the cost of emotional overinvestment. They've walked that path before, giving too much, hoping too long, staying too quiet. But now they're awake. They see clearly. And with that clarity comes the power to choose differently. They choose relationships where they don't have to guess, chase, or translate emotional distance into something it's not. They choose to be met. Avoidants often mistake this withdrawal as rejection, but it's not. It's a boundary. It's the empath saying, I see you. I understand you, but I won't carry you. That refusal to rescue forces the avoidant to face their own growth. Because if they want to be in the presence of real love, the kind that sees them fully, they have to rise to meet it. Not because they're being demanded to, but because they're being invited to. The question is whether they'll accept that invitation or keep hiding from it. When an avoidant meets a super empath, it may seem like a balanced exchange. One pulls away, the other leans in. But that illusion eventually breaks, because empathy without boundaries doesn't serve either person. And emotional distance, once seen clearly, can no longer be romanticized. The super empath doesn't force growth, but they invite it. And when that invitation is continually declined, they walk, not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Avoidants don't lose the empath because they weren't cared for. They lose them because they mistook unconditional compassion for unlimited patience. They thought silence would always be met with softness, that withdrawal would always be forgiven, that emotional minimalism would continue to be accepted. But the empath grows too. And one day, they stop dancing around avoidance. They stop trying to prove their worth. They stop overextending, and they start choosing themselves. Love, real love, isn't about controlling closeness or performing understanding. It's about mutual presence, mutual effort, mutual growth. Anything less is a pattern, not a partnership. So if you are a super empath, know this: your depth is not too much. Your clarity is not confrontational. Your intuition is not a burden. You are not here to fix people who refuse to face themselves. You're here to be met, not managed. You're here to be loved, not tolerated. And if you're the avoidant, there's no shame in your story, but there is a choice. You can stay hidden, guarded, and safe, or you can step forward, risk connection, and meet the kind of love that's been patiently waiting for you to stop running from it. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. Honor your empathy, and never confuse emotional unavailability with emotional depth. Be brave enough to grow and bold enough to walk away when someone won't. Thank you. Goodbye. Stay true.